I'm Ann McKee, the campus minister at Maryville College, and I am standing with Dr. Ron Wells, who is the director of the Maryville College Symposium on Faith and the Liberal Arts. We're in the Center for Campus Ministry at Maryville College, where just a few weeks ago a group of scholars gathered to discuss the future of the church-related college.
Thank you, Dr. McKee. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to recall that good weekend when we had the conference here. What you viewers are about to see is a part of that conference, a panel discussion of some of the scholars who were the main presenters. They'll be joined by some others. The video gives a vivid and engaging sense of the real issues that we tried to explore on the theme of the future of the church-related college. We hope and trust you'll enjoy seeing this short video.
So welcome to Maryville College and God's blessings as you consider your own issues of faith and scholarship.
We heard from the Jacobsons yesterday what I'm kind of saying is to do with the trends in higher education for both any sort of higher education and church-related institutions up to kind of where we are now, and I think they articulated those things really well for us. Bo, I think, brought us back to the idea of particularity. So they were talking kind of about the big picture of what's going on, and then Bo talked about a particular tradition, the Presbyterian tradition, and what it brings to the table of higher education and why it's a good thing. This morning, Stephen talked to us about perhaps maybe some ways in which this isn't always happening the way we want it to, but what I took away was institutional support and the way we can network and look at systems that help us think about doing this better, not just kind of trends or our own anecdotal particular experience, but where are we working kind of systematically, and especially was not the first time we heard the word Lily, as we always do in these kinds of settings, and helping us think more systematically about that. So I appreciated that. I'll start with Elizabeth. I told her I wanted to ask her a little bit about governance, because thinking about these tensions between in a sectarian institution, perhaps, the freedom to do some of that, thinking that we talked about, people being worried, as Ron talked about last night, people saying, oh, you're going to bring in this coercion. There's that element that occurs in sectarian schools. And also whether that's even people who might be saying on a more widely based campus, I think we should have this identity. And coming up against that. And also people who feel that the market-driven approaches perhaps of their campus administration is undermining their ability to do the kind of mentoring that they want to do, that they think they have a mandate to do. And I just wondered if you would give us a couple of maybe strategies or ways of thinking about governance, Elizabeth, that's appropriate for us as faculty and staff that are kind of in these tensions.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. I think you've put up the interesting tension that many boards wrestle with, that of value versus how we survive in this vocation-driven culture. And for those of us who are liberal arts institutions, we all know that doing the liberal arts well is expensive. And so these are the challenges that most boards are wrestling with. I think there's some other issues out there as we think about the faith-based or church-related faith-based institutions or value-based institutions. There are a lot of issues that we discuss in within our colleges and universities that are discussed across the board in higher education. I think that boards have probably the most difficult time in higher education's history to balance these issues. Boards have become much more active as opposed to the honorary role that board members used to play. And in part of that activity is a requirement to hear what the issues are on campus, to look for opportunities to hear from the faculty, to hear from students, and certainly regularly hear from the administration. But together, collectively, be focused on what it is that the institutional mission and purpose and future vision should be in this rapidly changing education environment.
I really appreciate your comments, and the word I want to focus on in Elizabeth's remarks is on that word collective, and the idea that we are all in this expensive proposition of primarily residential liberal arts education. We know it's expensive. It takes a lot of personnel. And one thing I was thinking about when we were having the rather depressing presentation this morning, love ya, was that the change that maybe is most crucial here related to church relatedness is that change to an emphasis on serving, and service learning is one component of that, of being ambassadors to the world from your vocational particularity, and that it's not just the faculty who do it. This is where I'm a faculty developer, that's my job. And one of the things I really like about the faculty development work I do is that it includes anybody who's hired with the master's degree or higher. So our Res Life people are right there with us. And our faculty, our lovely liberal arts faculty, as well as those who are in the professions, participate for a year and a half in a conversation together about what it means to be a church-related institution, and what does it mean to be in your discipline or profession as a person of values or faith, and why is it that you do what you do, and think about that and articulate it, because students in your programs are going to want to know what energizes you. It's not just an objective test, it's about embodiment. And so that idea of being able to articulate the reasons for doing what you do seems to me to be a really important point for all of us to remember, that you're not just taking some doctrine that's out there, but you're saying, what happens to you personally? And interfaith work now is very different from ecumenical work. Mm-hmm. Interfaith work is about saying, okay, all of us agree, because we are human beings, that we need to serve. And after you are serving together, you practice articulating what it is that causes you to be called to that service, and respectfully have those conversations about your own experience. So I think it's a new terrain, but an energizing and optimism-inducing terrain.
And I wonder how much is generational. I was struck by Stephen's talk about the young astrophysicists. I mean, I think there are more people that understand, the analogy that is discussed within our faith work is we're all in our backyards, and we all come out together to work, and then we go back into our backyards to refresh and regenerate. And if you don't, which is why Faithiest was written, right, is because, well, if I'm an atheist that wants to serve, I don't feel like I have a community to go back into and be refreshed by. So in order to be able to do interfaith work, I have to develop one. So I think there is a sense that's developing amongst people, the particularity, and so maybe younger faculty, if they aren't educated by the ethos of the institution they go to, might be more ready for that when they come on a campus to say, oh yeah, this is our institution, whether I'm a Catholic serving or an agnostic serving on a Catholic campus or a Catholic serving on a Reformed campus, I'm recognizing the particularity of this institution. Any other responses either to things, the Jacobsons, you guys spoke most earliest and have had less time to respond to everyone else, but any responses either to what Elizabeth has talked about or anything else that you've heard this morning that you've got, or over the last 24 hours?
Get my licks in? No, I'll wait.
I did want to respond to something that you said earlier about the sectarianism of institutions. And the church is a very long institution, and it has many, many parts, and it has changed and evolved a lot. So, for example, the Jacobsons began with a 1900 distribution of the population that shows 80% Protestant. But that's a very generous definition of who's in. So if we look at actual church membership, we did not get up to 50% of the population was a member of any church until about 1900. That at the time of the Revolution, maybe 17% of the population was actually a member of a church, right? And we have an imagination that everyone was religious until 1965 and then it fell apart. But in fact, creating the broad church attachment reached its peak in the 50s, which is an anomalous era, and then declined to more like natural historic levels. Robert Wuthnow, who I think is the Dean of Sociologists of Religion now, wrote a book in the early 80s called The Restructuring of American Religion, in which he said the denominations name fights of a previous era. The new structural form of religion really is a liberal-conservative divide that cuts through all the denominations. And that will inevitably, I think, I'm going beyond Wuthnow here, lead to new institutional forms. So the dissolution of the current denominational forms doesn't mean the end of denominations. We're a group or species, we need institutions. If we want to teach people something, we have to have an institution to do it in. That's why we have colleges. So I think the fruit of the current pluriform swirling will be new institutions that will be denomination-like in their articulation of a distinctive tradition, sectarian in the sense that you mean it, and that we will be renewed in vigor in teaching this is a way to argue. Steve argued earlier that the service orientation of colleges can be a surrogate for their religious tradition rather than an outgrowth of it, and it is, I think, both of those things. And said, who can be against service? Well, libertarians are against service, right? And they are a potent argument on campus, and I think articulating that church response to the libertarian challenge, right, that greed is good, and selfishness and self-orientation is a good thing, is in fact a vital ministry of church-related colleges, most especially. And that will be one of the ways the form of the new institutionalism develops, is in response to that challenge.
Okay, any other thoughts on that?
I think, again, playing this out a bit more from this morning's discussion with Steve, it does seem that as we think about the future, again, it's listening to what the needs and interests are of the students as well as the young faculty, and how do we engage that young faculty, enable them to have an environment in which is safe to have these kinds of discussions. And you know, the one thing that seems clear to me, those institutions that are very clear about their church relatedness, is that they're focused on orienting their young faculty as well as their students into that ethos that has been accepted, and the framework, the religious framework that is part and parcel of the institution. And yet in a time when resources are declining and there's less time to do the things that we used to do, it's one of those issues that I think are real important. This is a very important issue to be focused on going forward, that we make sure we don't lose those small opportunities that turn out to be significant in return over the years of preparing young people and young faculty.
I'd like to take this in a little different direction. I think some of the pricing and some of what's going on in higher education is driven by the fact that we have these national rankings of institutions. And institutions chase after those national rankings in ways that are not necessarily helpful for them as institutions in their own locations. Most college students still go to college within 200 miles of where they live. And different colleges serve different constituencies in different ways. Let me just give a couple of examples. We're talking about the liberal arts here. And of course, the liberal arts are great. I love the liberal arts, okay? Please, everything I say.
Philosophy major.
I was a philosophy major. Okay, so I love the liberal arts. But the liberal arts is supposed to be about asking big questions and helping students think through big questions. And in many ways, the liberal arts have become expertified in ways that follow national trends, so that you can't ask big questions anymore in those classes. You ask these narrow questions that come out of the disciplines. And they're expensive to ask those questions that way, to run those questions that way, but it's what makes you move up in the national rankings, if possible, though there's hardly any jostling there at all. Part of what this market-driven national ranking does is it undercuts innovation. So if you go to the top schools in any of those rankings, they are loath to change anything they're doing because any change risks falling in the rankings. So there's no kind of innovation. Whereas what we need at this point in time is a tremendous amount of innovation. Some of the best education happening around big questions that are live questions for students are happening at community colleges, where people are still living in their home communities, whether those are communities of faith or ethnic communities or just neighborhood communities. They bring that into the classroom with them, and you have an honest conversation about things that really matter for students, and it's done at a relatively cheap cost. So I think, if we had a basic message for our presentation, it's that there used to be just one way of doing church-related, and that was so overwhelmingly Protestant there had to become two ways, one Protestant and one Catholic. And then in most of the 20th century, there was a move to, there's only one way to be a real university, which is to follow this national research university model. What we're saying is in this 21st century, there's room for a tremendous plurality of institutions to address different questions in different ways that are appropriate for the students they serve. But some other mechanisms within higher education make it difficult for schools to embrace their own particularity and to be creative in serving that constituency. And I wish that we could inject more confidence into institutions to do that. A lot of it, though, is related to money, because we're all worried that anything we do may offend someone as well as attract someone new. So these are they're difficult questions. There's no doubting that. But we need to, I think, encourage diversity of kinds of institutions and innovation in those institutions to see if we can help these kind of big questions of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be part of a global society, and what it means to be a follower of a religious tradition, and in particular, a follower of Jesus Christ at this point in time.
Can I comment on that? That brings up something that Bo and I think, a concern we share. We come from comparable places. We were both at national liberal arts colleges. Center is ahead of us on the scale. We're clinging desperately to the bottom of the top 50, which is, I think, how far they go. And that is that requires a lot of sacrifices. It requires a lot of shaping of mission. At the top of that list are places like Amherst and Williams and Pomona, which for some reason have become, the schools we aspire to be like, even though we have very little in common with them. And it makes it very difficult to even raise the question of what it means to be a church-related college. The only church-related colleges on that top 50 list are places that are like us, Presbyterian Schools Center, McAllister, Davidson, all of whom are downplaying, I think it's fair to say, their church-relatedness and really emphasizing their quality. I've also heard people say about the cost of road. We're both about $50,000, I think, for a year. There have been discussions on our board about pricing, and one of the comments that was made is, well, we don't want to price too low because that indicates that it's really we're not as good as Amherst if we're that much cheaper. And apparently this is, these are comments about what consumers are thinking and so forth. I'm also thinking about, the full pay student, which at Rhodes, I'm sure at Center and Maryville is an important consideration, because we are not wealthy enough to meet everybody's financial needs, so we need some people to sort of help us carry the freight. And so we're recruiting a certain number of students whose families can write a check for the $50,000 or whatever it is. And those students may or may not be religious, but what's most characteristic of them is their sense of entitlement. And they give the school, when there's a critical mass of them, they give the school a certain kind of class character and a certain sort of level of entitlement that creates issues for dealing with.
Are we able to hear? Still, is that coming?
I don't think I can say that again because I don't think I remember it, but
If you have enough full-paying students, they have a sense of entitlement, and if there's enough of them, it creates a bit of an ethos that we can imagine.
So I have students in class last year, first-year students. They're talking, it's before spring break. They're talking about what they're doing, and one student says, "Well, we're going to New York for a shopping trip. We're going to the Bahamas." And I'm thinking, the other half of the class is sitting here listening to this, going, "What in the world are you talking about?" I have a Chinese student who obviously is not going anywhere over spring break, and others who were just sort of, like us, is thinking, "I thought about going to the beach, but I've got to raise money, together." It's just some really interesting dynamics that are created at colleges that are as expensive as ours are.
I would like to say something about what it is that we're teaching for. And I mentioned last night there is increasing pressure on all colleges to increase assessment. But the assessment is very dissatisfying to faculty because it's so short term. And we're trying to transform people's lives for the long term. And we really can't know when they graduate what they're going to be like. But I've been teaching long enough that I have many students who come back and appreciate what they learned, tell me about how they applied it, as often say, "I wish I'd paid more attention when I was a student. I kept those books, I'm reading them now. I want my kids to pay more attention than I did." And that formation goes to vocational training as well. Right? That the downside of being a vocational training school is that the jobs keep changing. That the capacity to train for this month's job will be out of date in 5 years. So even if you go chasing that trail, it's not actually a long-term strategy for viability anyway. And we are better off training vocationally for being a person who can adapt to new circumstances in the long run, which it turns out liberal arts education is the best training for. And as that is part of what the training for leadership is, it's not just leadership in a political sense, but leadership in a vocational sense. That goes right back to our core mission, which I think is a church mission as well.
Yes, thanks. Go ahead.
When Jake and I were going around to various campuses, we were educated ourselves in so many ways. In particular, I'm thinking of Catholic colleges and universities, and when they were talking to us about their seminaries, we were a little astonished because they were quite upfront about the fact that it's vocational training. You learn how to do the practices of the church. It's not about liberal arts. And I talked to Bo last night about his wonderful course on coffee house culture. And I thought, oh, what a great course. I would love to take it. But in some ways, I feel as if, as Protestants, we conflate faith-based or church-related with the humanities and those liberal arts questions embedded in the humanities, instead of talking about vocation much more broadly. So I'm with you with regard to the need to train for life. You are learning to be a lifelong learner. That's what it's all about. But at the same time, I'm not sure, I love the humanities, I'm not sure that humanities specialists are always the people who are in actuality able to lead student discussions about the big questions of life. I'll make a negative comment so my husband can look good doing the positive. I'm sweet that way. One gross generalization about our time on church-related campuses, and we have visited a good number of them, is that very frequently the particular individuals who were least enthusiastic about what we call the pluriform era were those from religious studies programs. And indeed, I think because of many of them being educated during the heyday of the privatized era, wanted to say, this is our area of specialization, and we want to keep it segregated from the broader work of the institution, because none of those other folks are specialists. So that is certainly not the case at all institutions. Let me be clear. That is not the case at all. But at many, they were the folks who were most concerned about this project of having big questions of meaning and purpose delegated more broadly.
Let me say something along these same lines and picking up on what the students were talking about. It's still a fact that most individuals in the United States make primary decisions about the moral and spiritual trajectories of their lives between the years of 18 and 24. After that, conversion and religious switching is relatively rare. And granted, looking back on it, I thought I was asking big questions when I was in college. Now I sometimes listen to the questions students are asking, I think, that's really goofy. But it's still, those are the questions you ask, and those are the ones that gel into the kind of trajectory you're going to follow. And it's going to become much more refined and much more developed over the years. But you develop a certain kind of orientation. And that can happen in many places. So just a couple of stories. Talked to one person who taught astrophysics. Had a student come in and say, could I talk to you about something personal?
And this was at a major research university.
This is at a major research university, a public university. Can I talk to you about something personal? I was raised by secular parents to be a secular person, but the more I study the universe, the more it seems so wonderful and awesome, I think I'm beginning to believe in God. Is that okay? I think sometimes faculty find themselves caught between being academically respectable colleagues with their peers in the academy, which is very important, and remembering still what it's like to be 18 or 19 or 20 years old. We were at a top-notch school. I think this is a student from Williams said, faculty sometimes we see you react negatively when people say you're supposed to be mentors for us. And she said, let me tell you what we mean by a mentor. We don't want much of your time. We actually don't want to spend a lot of time with you. You're kind of an old fogey. But once in a while, we'd like to have a conversation about real things in real life with somebody who's older than us and a little further along the journey. And it can be those really short conversations that may just last 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, and maybe you don't even talk to that person again. And everybody who teaches knows, homecoming, you have somebody come up to you and say, remember when we talked, you changed my life. And for this, you don't have a clue who this person is. Even after they tell you who they are, you don't have a clue who they are. Because it can be these short exchanges. So it's not overburdening faculty with becoming youth counselors or youth pastors. It can be little exchanges that take place. But I think it's all across the curriculum. And in some ways, it's not as much in religion, because religion's their professional, it's my professional task. So to talk with somebody who's not that, who still is a person of faith in some way and you can bounce ideas off of, can be life-changing.
That's great. Yes, John.
I'm John Coates from the League, which is a Pentecostally sponsored school, which I'm not embarrassed to be working at. I also am a Presbyterian, however, that's at school. I'm curious. Almost all the conversation has been couched in what Ron termed the third way. So Lisa and I both teach at schools that are the first way. You subscribe then to Bertrand Marsden declensionist theory that we're dying slowly or quickly, or maybe Cunningham's that we really should evolve to get to the third way. Or what's our future? Where do you see that?
I mentioned Burchell's book last night. This is The Dying of the Light, which was an important 90s study of schools in various traditions. And his general finding was schools that were started with a church mission really had a clear idea of what the mission was, but they didn't have the money to do it. And so their quest was, let's get enough money to endow our school so that we can really be Christian. But the consequence of becoming endowed was they were free from the church and didn't have to do that mission anymore and could do what they wanted, which was driven by the academy. And I think that tension is almost inevitable. It takes a really strong pro-intellectual church culture to keep supporting schools that will do the church mission but have enough money to say no. Our schools, the Presbyterian schools we've been talking about and where we sit right now, have separated from the church formally, in part because the church no longer provides the resources. Then we have to get them from someplace else, and that someplace else is not as invested in that mission. So if you can get, as Steve's job is, someone invested in the mission of teaching Bible to give you $50 million to teach Bible, that is one of the ways of sustaining at least that thing, right? If you have a really rich Adventist who said, I'll give you money as long as you stay Adventist, that would be a thing that would pay the bills but keep the church tradition. But if we go for money in general to support the vision in general, the money beats the vision.
Might the value of the denomination be measured in something other than cash? In other words, when you lose your board of directors and then you lose your administration and you've lost your faculty and you've lost your students, maybe the value of the denomination is more than the $2 million that you gave.
Right. I should add to that. The important thing that colleges get from denominations is not money, but students.
Right.
Right, and that really is the validation. When we get like a student like Sarah Diane who says, I wanted a church college, I wanted a Presbyterian college, that is the thing that can't be replaced. And if we seek that, we be a place where those rare students, unusual students want to be, then the money will follow. Then other people who want to support that student in that place will come. It's hard to have enough students who want that to fill the student body. And so most of them come with a general sense that this would be a good place to go to school, and if they have a religious development afterwards, then in retrospect they see it was a good thing I went to church college that helped me ask these big questions, but they didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, Jake.
I just want to say two things. I don't think still tightly connected denominational schools are following the first way, if you mean the old Protestant model. I mean, we are all living in an age of globalization where we are training students to live in a global and diverse and pluralistic world, which was not the case of the old Protestant way. It was training students to fit into one particular culture in one particular way. So we're doing something very different, I think, all of us. And in a place like Lee, the fact that you're a Presbyterian there, Lee, means it's again, there's a pluralism within a certain range at that institution which separates it from what was there before. But I think one of the great things about more tightly denominationally related schools is that it reminds students that you live someplace, not no place. A lot of what national liberal arts colleges teach students, or not teach students, but nurture them into, is that they live in no particular place. They are cosmopolitan in their view. Most people in the world are not cosmopolitan that way. They live in particular places. The only particular people who understand the particularity of their own identity can really understand people with other particular identities. So I think there's a special gift. That's why we say I think there's room for lots of different models of this stuff to go on that fits the needs of different students and prepares them for interacting with the world in different ways. And they're all valid and can be good. There's levels of excellence and non-excellence in all of those categories, but there's many different categories. And I'm going to go back to my old mentor, Martin Marty, who would always make a distinction between being tribal and being tribalistic. And being tribal means you know who you are, you know who your people are, and you reach out from there. Being tribalistic is when you know who your people are, that's all you care about, that's all you talk about, and it centers in. And there's a tension, but it's always, it's not something you can settle once and for all, because it's a dynamic tension to actually constantly push to emphasize tribal identity as opposed to becoming tribalist, and you need people who know the traditions and can use them flexibly to make sure you're keeping to push these institutions to the one side of that equation and not to the other, I think.
I did want to say one thing about mentorship, and this goes to whether it's religious studies' job to carry this ball. Some years ago, I organized a conference on what I thought was an excellent marketplace of ideas conversation. What does the Bible say about homosexual practice? And as a result of even asking the question and inviting scholars on both sides of that question, I was excoriated by faculty as well. And from that experience, decided I don't really care what they think. My life is with students, and what that means, and I love my colleagues and work fine with them and have roles in the college, but that's not where my heart is. And so, and I think any member of the faculty in any discipline, in any position, if that's where your heart is, my life is with students, then you necessarily are involved in their working through the big questions of life, in little conversations, in big ones, when they're students, when they're alums, for the rest of their days. And that really is what we're about.